Most people think they already know the full story of Back to the Future. They think it is a fun, lovable movie about a teenager, a crazy scientist, and a time-traveling car. They think the story behind the camera was just as cheerful as what played out on the screen. They think the version they watched is the only version that ever existed. But what if that is completely wrong? What if the Back to the Future that the whole world fell in love with was never supposed to exist at all? What if buried underneath that fun, feel-good movie is a completely different film? One that was darker, stranger, and deeply disturbing. A version that made studio executives so uncomfortable that they scrambled to erase it before a single audience member could ever see it? Because that is exactly what happened. And once you hear the real story, you will never watch Back to the Future quite the same way again. There was a nuclear explosion written into the original ending. There was a forbidden emotional storyline, so disturbing that Disney refused to go anywhere near it. There was an actor who spent weeks filming the lead role, only to have every trace of him quietly removed. There were lawsuits that permanently changed the rules of Hollywood. And there were real moments of life-threatening danger behind the camera that the studio chose to keep very, very quiet. This is the full story of the disturbing original version of Back to the Future. The version that was almost made. The version the studio tried to erase. And the version that, even today, is still hiding just beneath the surface of the movie you think you already know. The idea that started everything came from a quiet afternoon and an old yearbook. Screenwriter Bob Gale was sitting at home flipping through his father's high school yearbook when a strange thought crossed his mind. What if you could travel back through time and meet your parents when they were teenagers? Would you like them? Would they like you? It sounds innocent enough. But when Gale shared that idea with his writing partner Robert Zemeckis, something grew out of it that was anything but innocent. The script they began developing together was heavy, paranoid, and uncomfortable in ways that nobody in Hollywood was prepared for. And when they started taking it around to studios looking for someone brave enough to make it, they heard the same answer again and again. No. More than 40 studios reportedly passed on the project. Executives could not figure out what kind of movie it was. It was not raunchy enough for the adult comedy crowd. It was not clean enough to sell as a simple family film. Several executives reportedly described it as too strange and too difficult to market to a mainstream audience. Then Disney took a look. And after reading the script, Disney walked away too. Not because the story was confusing, because it was disturbing. Specifically because of a storyline involving a teenage boy who travels back in time and discovers that his own mother has developed romantic feelings for him. Disney decided that was far too uncomfortable for their audience and passed without hesitation. The rejections kept coming. Nobody wanted anything to do with it. Then the tide began to turn. In 1984, Romancing the Stone became a genuine box office success. And suddenly Robert Zemeckis was a name studios were paying attention to. Universal Pictures stepped forward and gave Back to the Future the green light it had been waiting for. The project that nobody had wanted was finally going to be made. But by the time Universal said yes, the screenplay had already changed quite a bit from what Zemeckis and Gale had first imagined. Because the original version of Back to the Future was so dark and so unsettling that much of it had already been quietly pushed aside before a single camera ever rolled. And what that original version actually contained is something most fans have never fully heard. Forget the shiny silver DeLorean. Forget the flux capacitor. Forget the lightning strike at the clock tower and Marty playing guitar at the school dance. None of that existed in the beginning. In the earliest drafts of the screenplay, the time machine was not a car at all. It was described as something closer to a large box, cold, heavy, and industrial, something that looked more like a piece of laboratory equipment than a vehicle for adventure. There was nothing exciting about it, nothing cinematic, and the tone of those early pages matched that machine perfectly. Where the finished film feels warm and alive, those early drafts felt paranoid and heavy. The story was soaked in the fears that defined everyday life in the early 1980s. Nuclear weapons, the Cold War, the genuine, daily terror that the world was sitting right on the edge of annihilation. These were not background details in the original script. They sat at the very center of the story, and nowhere was that darkness more visible than in the original ending. In the first version of Back to the Future, Marty did not use a lightning bolt to power his journey home. The climax of the movie was set in the Nevada desert, where Marty's plan was to harness the energy of an actual nuclear bomb test to send himself back to his own time. A teenage boy, a desert, a rising mushroom cloud, a last desperate sprint against the blast. That was the ending Zemeckis and Gale originally wrote. It was genuinely terrifying, and it made a strange kind of sense for the world they were writing in, where nuclear anxiety was woven into the fabric of everyday American life. But it was also deeply unsettling in a way that studio executives simply could not get comfortable with. They pushed back hard. The nuclear ending was removed. The box-shaped machine was replaced with something flashier. The Cold War paranoia was smoothed over until only a faint shadow of it remained beneath the surface of the finished film. What audiences eventually saw was lighter, faster, and warmer. But something real had been erased in the process. A version of the story that had stared directly at the darkest fears of its era without flinching. The studio had cleaned everything up and made it safe. But one problem remained that no amount of cleaning could easily fix. Even after the nuclear ending was gone and the script had been softened, there was still the matter of the relationship between Marty and his own mother. And that storyline was deeply, genuinely uncomfortable in ways that went far beyond what the finished film shows. On the surface, the plot reads simply enough. Marty goes back to 1955, accidentally stops his parents from meeting, and has to bring them together before he disappears from history. Straightforward adventure territory. But underneath that simple premise sat something far stranger and far more disturbing. In 1955, Lorraine is a teenager. She does not know that the boy she has just met is her own son from the future. She only knows that she is drawn to him, attracted to him. And in the earliest drafts of the screenplay, the writers did not soften that with humor or hold the audience at a safe distance from it. The emotional tension was written sincerely, rawly, with no protective comedy wrapped around it, which meant that audiences watching that version of the film would have been asked to sit with something genuinely disturbing, with nothing to ease the discomfort. Multiple studios pointed to this subplot specifically when they passed on the project. Disney had already walked away because of it. Even the executives at Universal who ultimately said yes pushed hard for it to be handled more carefully. The filmmakers understood the problem, but they also understood that removing the subplot entirely would destroy the entire engine of the story. Without Lorraine's feelings for Marty, there is no tension. Without tension, there is no movie. So they made a deliberate choice. They kept the storyline, but buried it under layers of comedy and warmth and fast pacing, trusting audiences to follow them through the uncomfortable parts without losing faith in the film. It worked, but the discomfort never fully disappeared. It just went quiet, and it was sitting quietly in those early disturbing drafts, waiting for the actor who was originally hired to bring Marty McFly to life. Because that actor understood the darkness in those pages far better than anyone had anticipated. Before Michael J. Fox ever sat inside a DeLorean, another actor had already spent weeks living in the role of Marty McFly. His name was Eric Stoltz, and the performance he was building matched those dark, uncomfortable early drafts in ways that alarmed almost everyone on set. When casting first began, Michael J. Fox was always the filmmaker's first choice. He had exactly the energy, charm, and natural likability that the character needed. But Fox was locked into his television commitments on the hit sitcom Family Ties and could not get free. So the filmmakers moved to their next option and hired Eric Stoltz instead. Stoltz was genuinely talented. He had recently delivered a powerful, emotionally serious performance in the film Mask, where he played a teenager living with a severe facial disfigurement with remarkable depth and honesty. He was considered an excellent choice. Filming began. Weeks passed. Millions of dollars were spent building the production around him. And slowly, quietly, it became obvious that something was deeply wrong. Stoltz was not playing Marty the way the softened, lighter, funnier version of the script now needed him to be played. He was bringing the same emotional seriousness and weight to the role that had made him so impressive before. His Marty was dark, quiet, inward, genuinely frightened and genuinely lost in a way that felt painfully real rather than performed. Scenes that were supposed to feel light and fun felt instead cold and airless. The comedy was dying in every take. The adventure was draining out of the movie one filming day at a time. The filmmakers faced one of the hardest decisions in Hollywood history. Weeks of completed footage. Millions of dollars already spent. A lead actor who had done absolutely nothing wrong except be exactly the kind of performer he had always been. And they replaced him anyway. Fox's television schedule was renegotiated, and he joined the production while still fulfilling his family ties commitments. He filmed the television show during the day and shot Back to the Future through the night and on weekends. It was a punishing arrangement, but it rescued the movie. The footage shot with Stoltz was buried. Almost everything was res-hot completely from scratch. His name was removed from the credits. The studio tried to erase him as thoroughly as possible from the film's history. But erasing someone from a movie is never quite as clean or complete as a studio would like it to be. Small fragments of Stoltz's footage have surfaced over the years. Behind-the-scenes clips, brief moments that slip through the reshoot process. And watching that footage is a genuinely strange experience. Where Michael J. Fox brings brightness and warmth to everything he touches, Stoltz carries something heavier and colder. His Marty looks genuinely frightened in a way that feels real. The lightness is completely gone. It feels like watching an entirely different film from a parallel timeline. But the most haunting detail is not found in the surfaced clips. It may be hiding inside the finished film itself. In the diner scene where Marty confronts Biff, there is one brief moment of physical action. A punch thrown in a split second. Dedicated fans who have studied that moment frame by frame have noticed that the arm, the fist, and the jacket sleeve visible in that instant do not appear to match Michael J. Fox's build. The suggestion is that audiences watching that scene are actually seeing Eric Stoltz's hand throwing the punch. The erased actor still present in the finished film, landing his one remaining moment on screen. It has never been officially confirmed. The studio has never addressed it directly, but it has never been convincingly dismissed either. And it fits perfectly into the pattern that runs through the entire production. A pattern of things being changed, buried, and removed, but never quite fully disappearing. Because the disturbances did not stop with a replaced actor. What came next turned into a legal battle that permanently rewrote the rules of Hollywood. When Back to the Future Part 2 entered production, Crispin Glover, the brilliantly strange actor who had played George McFly in the original, did not return. There were reported disputes over salary and creative disagreements about the direction the story was taking. Whatever the precise combination of reasons, negotiations collapsed and Glover walked away. George McFly was too central to the sequel to simply remove. So the studio made a decision that would have consequences nobody fully anticipated. They hired a different actor and used prosthetic makeup, reportedly based on molds of Crispin Glover's actual facial features, to make him resemble Glover as closely as possible. They then shot him from specific angles and moved him in specific ways to help maintain the illusion. Audiences watching the sequel were essentially being shown a reconstruction of an actor who had never agreed to appear in the film. A copy of a real person's face placed on screen without their knowledge or consent. When Glover discovered what had been done, he sued. And the lawsuit that followed forced Hollywood to confront or question it had never seriously had to answer before. Does a person own their own face? Can a studio legally recreate the appearance of a real individual without asking them? The case was eventually settled, and the Screen Actors Guild introduced new rules specifically designed to prevent it from ever happening again. It felt, at the time, like a resolved dispute from another era. A strange historical footnote. But decades later, as artificial intelligence began making it possible to recreate any human face with frightening accuracy, The questions Glover had forced Hollywood to ask suddenly felt more urgent and more dangerous than anyone could have imagined back then. And back on the set of the third film, a very different kind of danger had already been waiting. This one was not legal. It was physical. And it nearly ended everything. Back to the Future Part 3 is set in the American Wild West. Wide open landscapes, train chases, a simpler era. It must have seemed like the most straightforward of the three films to make. But the production carried a darkness with it that had nothing to do with outlaws or frontier justice. There is a scene in the third film where Marty is hanged. It is framed as a moment of high danger before the hero escapes, the kind of tense sequence adventure films use regularly. On screen, it lasts only seconds. Behind the camera, it very nearly became a tragedy. Michael J. Fox performed the scene himself. A rope was carefully rigged around his neck, designed to look convincing while keeping him completely safe. Stunt coordinators had planned every detail precisely. The shot was set up, the cameras rolled, and then something went wrong. The rope tightened in a way it was never supposed to. Fox's hand, which was meant to stay between the rope and his throat at all times to protect him, slipped out of position. For a brief, horrifying stretch of time, the pressure on his neck became genuinely life-threatening. He lost consciousness. It took the crew a moment to realize what was happening. By the time they cut him free, Fox had been unconscious long enough to frighten everyone present deeply. He recovered. Filming eventually continued, and the incident was quietly kept far away from the publicity surrounding the film's release. The cheerful, warm, feel-good energy of the finished Back to the Future trilogy existed in sharp and painful contrast to the exhausted, frightened, and sometimes genuinely endangered people who had made it. All of this chaos left its fingerprints on the finished films. The clock tower flyer visible at different points in the first film changes its wording between scenes in ways that the story's own logic makes completely impossible. The video camera Marty uses in 1955 appears to record from an angle that his physical position makes impossible. Background extras repeat across scenes set in entirely different locations at different times. Historical details in the 1955 sequences contain small but noticeable errors. The plutonium that powers the flux capacitor behaves differently from scene to scene with no consistent rules governing it. None of these things damage the movie. Fans have spent decades cataloging them with genuine affection, treating them almost like a hidden treasure map inside a beloved film. But together they tell a story of their own. The story of a production that was constantly reinventing itself under enormous pressure. A movie that replaced its lead actor, abandoned its original ending, survived a life-threatening accident on set, and somehow still became one of the most loved films ever made. The imperfections are proof. The chaos was completely real. So what was Back to the Future truly meant to be, before the studio got hold of it and started erasing things? Strip away the DeLorean, the lightning bolt, the warm ending, the humor, the hope. What is left underneath? A boy standing in a Nevada desert watching a nuclear cloud rise into the sky. A disturbing emotional storyline with no comedy protecting the audience from what it actually contains. A darker, colder, stranger story written in the shadow of genuine Cold War terror. A story that offered no easy comfort and made no attempt to leave audiences feeling safe. That version almost existed. Eric Stoltz almost brought it to life. And in fragments, in surviving behind-the-scenes clips, in a fist that may not belong to the actor credited with throwing it, in a flyer that cannot decide what it says, traces of it are still hiding inside the movie the whole world thinks it already knows. The simple answer for why the studio erased all of it is money. Executives make decisions based on what they believe audiences will pay to see, and a paranoid, disturbing Cold War drama with a deeply uncomfortable emotional core was not something anyone felt they could sell in 1985. But there is a deeper answer sitting underneath that one. The darker version of Back to the Future was missing something essential, something the writers may not have fully realized they needed until the pressure of production forced them to discover it. And that thing was hope. The idea at the very heart of Back to the Future, the idea that made it genuinely timeless, is that the past is not fixed. That the mistakes made by the people who came before you do not have to be permanent. That you can go back, repair things, and give people a second chance at the lives they deserved. That is an extraordinarily powerful thing to believe. It is why teenagers who watched this film years ago still return to it today. Not for nostalgia alone, but for the feeling it reliably produces every single time. The feeling that things can still get better. That the future has not been written yet. That there is still time. The nuclear ending could never have produced that feeling. The darker screenplay could never have delivered it. Only this version could. And so the disturbing original was quietly buried. The way all the best time travel stories eventually close their darkest timelines. With the gentlest possible suggestion that some versions of events are simply better left unrealized. The story found the ending it needed. And in doing so, it found the ending that all of us needed too.